Benjamin Whistler, an ENFJ, woke up early one morning with the sunrise. He woke up in bed next to his wife of less than a year, Andreea Whistler, who was an INTJ. She was still fast asleep. Benjamin knew that she probably wasn't going to wake up until noon, because despite her repeated promises, she was once again up until 2 o'clock in the morning working on some of her various projects on the desk in the corner of the room. But Benjamin smiled because, what are you going to do? Pushed aside the covers, got up. He went through a blanket curtain that portioned off the bedroom from the kitchen in their one-room trailer. He went in there, he pulled out a half portion of food that had been sent from the capital. They had not had a good harvest the previous year, and they had not been able to store up enough carrots, onions, barley, wheat, things for grain. They had only had enough to last them for so long, and now they were basically forced to work through rations. And it wasn't the best thing, but what you gonna do? He pulled out a half ration, a roll with some meat. He ate that, wolfed it down, and stepped outside to get a little bit of fresh air. He admired the purple-leaved trees, the smooth bark, the thick red grass, the whitish sand and rock, and the beautiful sunrise with greens and blues in the blue sky. It was another beautiful sunrise on the ferocious planet of Oberon. Benjamin had agricultural duties that week. He headed out with a number of other members of the village. There were probably about 50 families that made up this little village, all of them living in very similar looking trailers, all about the same size, all produced by the same group. They went out to their little garden fields where they had to prep the soil for about a month, and so they were in the midst of the very arduous soil preparation process. They were using special technology that had been handed out to them by the government from years ago. And so some of it was not in the best condition, but they had to work with it. Benjamin headed out and they started preparing the soil so that they could plant food that humans could actually eat. Oberon, unfortunately, had a tendency to replenish its own soil since they had managed to perform a harvest and make it better for growing what it wanted to grow, but not for growing what humans needed in order to eat. Furthermore, the air on Oberon was not always entirely friendly to humans either. There was often a certain degree of toxin or smog in it, and there had to be a number of special mechanical purifiers placed throughout the village that effectively produced a bubble of cleansed atmosphere. The village was surrounded by a 10-foot blue metal wall that enclosed the entire village. And the wall was fitted out with electrical weaponry and other deterrents in order to ward off all manner of predators and other kinds of nasty things that might try to mess with the villagers. And there was a train track that led out of the village that you could go to other villages via, almost like a metro. And all of this technology that they used in the village, from their means for cooking food, to their lighting, to their agriculture, to their air purification, to everything basically, was either all or in part built out of that same blue metal. It was called benzimite. Benzimite was supplied and absolutely controlled by the Grand Depot. And the Grand Depot was an executive branch of the single state, the Zacharian state. That was the only government on Oberon, as there were only about 2 million human beings on the face of the planet Oberon, and mainly all concentrated within the same continent. The Grand Depot controlled benzimite. Benzimite is extremely strong. It is relatively flexible and easy to push into different forms that you need. and it also has the absolutely remarkable property of producing its own electrical currents and power. I can't give that many details, though, at this point, because not a single one of the peasants, including Benjamin, the ENFJ, had any idea how benzimite worked, and this was by design. The Grand Depot did not allow anybody to study or tamper with or try to figure out any of the benzimite technology, and ideally any kind of technology at all. And if they could, they tried to limit the degree to which people understood more abstract mathematics or studied any kind of science that might lead into being able to understand how benzimite worked. And they were open about this. They were open about the fact that they were trying to keep people from understanding it. And they had been, as far as anybody could remember or anybody's ancestors could remember. The story went, the mythology you could say, that benzimite was given to them either by gods or by something like that. At this point, even the Grand Depot wasn't saying that it was necessarily the gods. They were just saying this was given to us by higher beings. And it is extremely dangerous. It is a gift given to us so that we can survive on this harsh world, because of essentially a kind of original sin sort of doctrine going on where human beings are cut off from the face of their own planet, Oberon, and are not able to, barely able to survive unless they have use from this very special metal. But it's extremely dangerous. And we don't want anyone but those who have been trained in the special authority of how to use this metal and the special knowledge to wield it. We don't want anyone else trying to mess with it, because when they do, it always leads to disaster. And this was a very real thing. This was not so much a spook, because people had, on very few occasions, but they had seen when benzimite is not hooked up properly, or when it's not framed properly in a technology, or it's not treated properly, or if for whatever reason it just starts breaking down, it begins to turn into blue rust. And blue rust isn't really rust. It's more like that slime that you would play with as a kid, that it seems wet and it seems to flow, but it's also very dry when you touch it. And it's very much like that, except the primary difference being that when you're a kid and you stick your hands into that stuff, then it just makes your hands dry. But when you stick your hands into blue rust, then you don't have any hands anymore. And then soon enough, you won't have any arms and probably not a face anymore, because from the stories anyway, though no one's actually seen it because they've all been too afraid, the stories say that blue rust will tend to latch onto the body and devour people whole. And there's one old fellow in the village who even claims that he lived in a village where some heretical moron had tried tampering with the blue metal material because he was sick and tired of having to work through the Grand Depot. And he tried to fix some of his agricultural technology himself, and also fixed his own oven and began tampering with them. And soon enough, it turned into blue rust one fine morning. And this old man said that it actually turned into beings who slaughtered everyone in the village and ate them alive before the Grand Depot could come and stop them. And he himself, this old man, was the only survivor. He only told this story when he was drunk, though, and yeah. So if anybody ever wanted to repair this technology, or if there was ever any kind of problem, or heaven knows, if there was blue rust that somebody found, then the Grand Depot had to be contacted immediately, and they would send in a mechanic in order to handle it themselves. But none of the ordinary peasants could, only people who were specially qualified. Now, Benjamin actually agreed in principle with how the Grand Depot was handling things in the name of the Zacharian state. He agreed with the principles of keeping people away from technological knowledge. He had certain philosophical reasons for that. He felt that it could easily lead to danger or to becoming too materialistic or something like this. However, he was not a fan of the superstition or the application that the Grand Depot tended to use, or the fear-mongering that people had, and this had bothered him for a long while. Benjamin, aside from his, I guess, pseudo-semi-communist kind of peasant feudalism agricultural duties, whatever you want to call them, Benjamin was also a writer, and he had written a number of various articles for a publisher within the village who had been given access to a machine by which he could print journals and things and distribute them throughout the various villages in their district, which is called District Epsilon. So that's one of the many districts of the Zacharean state. Benjamin had published and had become fairly a bit well known. He had established a name for himself as being able to write fun stories, but also very concerned philosophical articles that sort of were a little tiny bit subversive, but finally one day he just had enough of it and he wrote his masterwork, which was a pamphlet called In Safe Hands. And it was, it made quite a sensation throughout the entire state. Mostly in District Epsilon, but it had been spreading throughout the entire state because he seemed to have touched a nerve. He had managed to find a nerve and he within the whole state, and he touched on what everybody was thinking but no one was saying, and he did it in a very open, popularized, easy to understand way. And his famous quote in that pamphlet, In Safe Hands, was that I would much rather have an engineer who was confident so that his hands didn't shake when he's trying to fix my blue metal materials than one who is terrified that he's going to cause the end of the world if he does something wrong, and therefore causes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And his point being that we need to get rid of this superstition and fear-mongering. We need to essentially fight back against some of these traditions and not be quite so afraid of the blue metal and be a bit more scientific about it. Now, these are fighting words. The conservatives within the state were not happy about this. And they were very concerned because they always know when you start to push the boundary and you start to open up a wound and let germs in there. And that's what Benjamin was doing. But there are also many others who felt within the Grand Depot and within the state who felt what Benjamin was saying. And they agreed, and it had created a lot of controversy. And anyway, he was very popular in the village for it, though, and people took very kindly to him, and so Benjamin headed out and began doing his work with the others. Andreea Whistler actually woke up a bit earlier than noon. She woke up probably about an hour after Benjamin left, running on very little sleep, but not really caring because her mind was still abuzz. She had ideas burgeoning in her mind, and she instantly got out of bed and didn't even eat breakfast, but went right over to the desk and began working. What was she working on? She liked to study biology. Biology is a gray area as far as the studying science and technology goes, because at least people's perceptions of biology is it does not immediately relate to any kind of technology. So it's like, well, I suppose if you want to do that, it's fine, but you are sending a subversive message with you doing it. But it's like, we don't want to be prudes, so we're not going to confront you about it. So she was kind of getting away with it. Of course, the funny thing is that really, if you're going to study biology, you kind of have to know a bit more about mathematics, because you need that to understand chemistry. Because you can't really understand biology unless you know some chemistry, especially if you're looking into genetics. And you need to definitely know scientific method. And you also need to get your hands on books. Books that can teach you and make it so that you don't have to start completely from scratch. Andreea, when she was much younger, had been starting from scratch. She had always wanted to learn more about the living world around her, and particularly wanted to know about genetics and how things were inherited as they went down the line of generations. She had always wanted to know more about this because even as a younger girl, she had always been frustrated with how incredibly inefficient the agricultural process was, and the fact that it had supposedly always been that way. And even from early on, she wasn't sure she really bought into that. If there's anything that annoyed her, it was the authoritarianism of the Grand Depot and the fact that they were always interposing themselves between her and her friends, her village, and getting the outcome that they needed to survive. And she loved Benjamin, but secretly in her mind, she didn't feel that Benjamin was radical enough, really, but she was never going to tell him that. Andreea, loving Benjamin as she did, often felt that, in her opinion, he felt a little bit too shallow in his. He didn't quite scrape deep enough and would often get a little tired too quickly with their conversations. But he was still a whole lot better than some of the other people who she had felt like she tried to communicate with about it. And they did, besides personality, have temperaments that were a bit more mild and were able to get along in certain areas. Well, anyway, Benjamin did not know. He knew that she studied biology, and he actually appreciated that. He did not know, however, all the other things that she had managed to have to pick up in order to study biology. And nobody but Andreea and somebody else knew that Andreea had gotten a hold of some books that, according to the Grand Depot, no one should have. These were ancient books. She hadn't got her hands on the books themselves, but she had gotten a hold of a dealer, a strange wanderer who we'll talk about in a later episode, who had sold her translations that had been done by somebody else who had the books in their possession. They had done translations and they were selling them to Andreea so that Andreea could read them and study biological knowledge and knowledge of genetics that ancient people had apparently understood to an overwhelming degree. But no one was supposed to read these sorts of books. They had heard about them, these ancient texts. But you weren't supposed to read those things because they might be talking about benzamite. But Andreea now had these translations in her possession. And she had heard that someone, a rumor, that someone in another village and possibly another district had been caught with translations. And she knew that it probably was from the same translator and the same dealer. And no one had heard from them again. After their trial, they were taken to the Great Brass Tower, where criminals were taken once they were convicted of crimes against humanity. Andreea was nervous about that, but she knew what she wanted to do. She wanted to figure out, she had to figure out, how to breed crops, how to create agriculture that could be nourishing to humans, but could also grow on this planet Oberon. If she could do it, it would change everything. And she was driven. But as we will see, her possession of those translations are what's going to kickstart this grand story and this whole adventure that she and Benjamin and a lot of other people are going to get swept up in.